academics and practitioners have been talking about resilience actually for quite a long time, but it was about 6 years ago, just over 6 years ago, when DFID released its review of humanitarian aid, the HER, which had this call that we should all be focusing more on resilience. That really opened a floodgate for workshops, meetings, conferences, academic papers, research, budget lines, all geared towards resilience. And for the past 6 years or 7 years, it's hard to be in the aid world and not hear conversations about resilience. And I've been asked to take 10 minutes to distill all of the wisdom that has been gained from all these academic studies on climate change, on DRR, on sustainable development, and to try and distill for you and tell you what do we now know about resilience. So I'm not going to do that. And I'll say at the end a word about why I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do is, I've been working with Valid International on a project the last 3-4 years, and we were asked to look at whether or not using multi-year humanitarian financing over a longer term actually helped to build resilience. And in order to do that, you've got to actually understand what it is that makes people resilient. So we've spent the last 3-4 years talking to a lot of people in Pakistan, Sudan, Ethiopia and DR Congo, trying to understand their resilience. And we were especially asked, particularly by USAID and DFID, as part of that study, to have a look at the last drought in Ethiopia. And they wanted to know all the money which has been spent on resilience over the last years, to what extent did it help people to cope with that drought? So we went and we had a look. And I'm going to try and present some of those lessons from that research. And I'm going to do it, I'm going to draw on the framework which was produced by one of the leading Western thinkers of the early 21st century. I'm referring, of course, to Donald Rumsfeld. And I'm going to talk about some unknowns. I'm going to talk about some known unknowns. I'm going to mention some wrongly knowns. I'm going to reflect on what we shouldn't try to know. And finally, I'm going to mention some potential knowns. So we went looking for the resilience investments, and we weren't worried about the word. I mean, it could be called sustainable development. And we were looking in a part of Ethiopia where projects go back for ages, and every NGO in the world and the UN has said, give us the money and we will make this, Kebele they call them over there, these groups of villages, we're going to make their livelihoods viable and sustainable. So we said, okay, great, we'll go and look, and we know we can do that, this sort of trial stuff. We'll go where there wasn't an investment, where there was an investment, can we find a difference? Well, the first thing is we couldn't find any investments. We asked the donors, well, can you tell us where different projects ran? Oh no, you better ask the NGOs that. So we spent 6 months trying to get that information from the NGOs. No record anywhere of actually what was done where. Not accessible, couldn't be given to us. Now, so all you have instead is this patchwork of ad hoc short-term projects. Now, from a research point of view, that's a nightmare. Because you can't research it if you don't know where it was. I have to be honest and say that whether or not it makes life easy for a researcher isn't really the point. The point is that all of this money is being spent without any kind of coherent plan, and we know that there was no coherent plan because no one knew what had been done before. So when everybody was planning their short-term ad hoc project, it wasn't actually done on the basis of, well, here's what we've all done together, what more needs doing? So we decided, well, we'll go anyway, and we'll see what we find. And sure enough, I mean, we did find, some stories of some investments. And you hear an awful lot of anecdotal success stories. When you take a closer look, you'd have to say that the short answer, let's say, was, to what extent did all the investment in resilience help people to cope? The short answer is, it didn't. Sadly, we have to face that truth. And there's a reason. It doesn't mean that we were doing the wrong things necessarily. If you look at the scale and the coverage, they were tiny. A year, 2-year projects is not going to transform people's lives enough that they can cope with the kind of severe drought that they faced in 2014 to 2016. If I say the impacts were mixed, well, I mean literally mixed. We see, you see some positive stuff, particularly, when you put in a water system in an arid area, you can imagine that on the whole, you're producing some really important critical benefits for people. When I say mixed, well, a lot of the systems simply weren't resilient, and in a drought they broke down because there was no electricity for the pump, because the hydroelectric failed because there was no water behind the dam. And they couldn't get the fuel for the diesel pumps. See, and everything breaks down. So we had a lot of that. We had some negative impacts. We had places where people rushed to put in boreholes, result the water table drops, and all the sources of water had dried up for the first time in, beyond living memory. It was quite clear, as I say, there was no coordination, no coordinated plan. More than that, there was no strategy. Nowhere can you find a description of, well, what would this district look like if it were resilient, if livelihoods were viable? What economic infrastructure would you need? And, critically, how much would it cost and how long would it take to deliver that? So we're not actually working against a plan that says we're going to need X billion over 10, 20, 30 years, and here is how to spend it. Instead, we're kind of messing about with $1 million here, a couple of million there. You know what? In one district that we looked at in Ethiopia alone, the lost assets of livestock in a year was, if I remember off the top of my head, 250 million. Yeah? Compare that to the amount of money that we're pumping in projects. It's kind of insignificant. Okay, some wrongly knowns. I'm going to have I'm allowing myself like a 40-second rant here. I have lately been reading quite a lot of research reports telling us how wonderful resilience projects are and how they're making a difference to people. And I've been taking a close look at some of them. And I would call them pseudo-academic studies. They're dressed up to look like academic studies. They've got lots of statistics in and graphs in, usually commissioned by aid agencies. And they tell us that resilience investments are making a difference. And an awful lot of kind of sigmas and averages and so on, the kind of stuff which any aid agency personnel are going to flip over because their eyes glaze over. If you actually kind of look beneath the surface and look at the methodology, which we tend not to do, some of the methodologies are so shocking that it is actually hard to believe that it is incompetent alone. Claims made, which even when they present evidence, the actual evidence shows that they had no impact, and then they're saying there was an impact. I can only conclude, to be honest, that not all of the studies, but there is even a certain amount of unethical behaviour going on, I think, disingenuous. And this is really, really worrying. Great business model. Yeah? It's a great business model for an aid agency to be able to produce reports that say it's working, if you want to ask for money. And it's a fantastic business model for a consultant to be known for giving aid agencies the answers that they want. I know because I know how much I don't do that and what people tell me about it. If we, never mind the fact that we're undermining any kind of trust in ourselves, and these things do blow up on us, and we know that, how on earth can we sensibly plan when we're kidding ourselves about what works and what doesn't work? We're not lying to ourselves, we're not lying to our donors, we're actually lying to the people who we're supposed to be trying to help, because we are perpetuating what doesn't work, rather than actually trying to find out what would help them. God, they need some help. There you go, that's the end of my rant. Let's have a look to see, well, what actually across the country has helped people cope. And the problem is, and this is kind of one of the funnily enough, life isn't quite as simple as we'd like it to be. And that would be a startling conclusion if it weren't for the fervour with which we adhere to our models. And when you actually take a closer look, all of our models evaporate. And again, this was quite troubling, particularly as a researcher. You're trying to look for your different indicators of whether people coped or not, and every indicator goes in a different direction with different people. There's just no consistency, which is really troubling, because it means we don't have any indicators at all for what counts as coping. Because you do well on one thing, you did badly on another. You got more into debt, but you ate better. People having more People having more livestock, for example, having more assets, that's supposed to help people cope. No, the more you had, the more you lost. As a percentage, the more you lost. Not just that, when you had more to lose. The people who got wiped out were the ones with big herds. The ones with small herds actually cope much better in many places. And what we found was, again, shouldn't be unsurprising, but I'll say in a second why it still is quite shocking that this is the case. What people's resilience or their vulnerability depended on was really boring stuff like opportunities. If people were able to migrate and find work, then they coped a bit better. In places where there was nowhere to go because there were no jobs anyway, people didn't cope very well. So, for example, the Somalis we were looking in a couple of different places, one of which was in Somali region. And there, of course, they've got cousins and clan members across the border in Somaliland and in town and in Djibouti and so on. The ones who were able to move around, fantastic. When I say fantastic, I mean it means they stayed alive, yeah. And the ones in an area which is much more rural, much more isolated, no job, there is no town economy to move to, they cope really, really badly. Again and again we're here, and not just from the emergency. It's like, well, education is critical. Who can get to secondary education? If you've got a relative in town, you can get to secondary education, because the secondary education is only in town, so you've got to have a brother in town that you can send your kids to. So these kind of family linkages, the ability to move, which is constrained by governments, it's constrained by conflict, that was a real critical factor. And finally, personal factors. Obviously, there's things like health. There's really surprising stuff. And why I say it's surprising, you know what? These people are just like us. Isn't that amazing? They actually need the same stuff that we do. They need family courts that work, so that when a husband walks out and leaves the kids, and there is a law around maintenance, the mother can actually go to the court and get a proper decision. And all that, this is what people are bringing up. And it's like, good heavens, those are the kind of things that, that we worry about in our countries. Well, yes, kind of, why would we think that anything is different just because, they're on a different latitude or longitude, whatever it is? And finally, on this one, the biggest single factor for somebody's resilience or vulnerability shouldn't be a surprise, is whether you're a man or a woman. If you're born a woman, sorry, and there's not a lot that the NGOs are doing about that. I was in Islamabad a couple of months ago and had an interesting experience. Part of the same research project with Valid. And we were planning the final round, going back, we were looking, well, where do we need to probe more in our interviews, to learn a little bit more about how the resilience and vulnerability is working. And we were looking at all the issues, and we were planning to go to an area where the projects were just starting up, I think including some members of your alliance. And so we were looking at land and land ownership and the whole feudal system. We were looking at gender. We were going through all of these things that we needed to kind of fine-tune our understanding. And at one point, the Pakistani colleagues on the research were saying, well, hold on a minute, Simon. Yeah, this is what we need to know, but this doesn't actually touch on. If we want to understand about the impact of the projects, none of this is relevant because the projects are doing completely different stuff, like drilling wells. And I was suddenly faced by the reality that everything which seemed to us, when you tried to understand people's lives as being absolutely critical to their resilience, was being ignored by a project whose title was Resilience Building. And the question is, how is that possible? So if we stop, let me talk about what we shouldn't seek to know and what potentially we do know. If we kind of forget resilience and forget worrying about this word and actually say, well, hold on a minute, I am looking at this population in this district, and it could be in Pakistan, it could be Ethiopia, it could be in northeast England, it could be anywhere, yeah? What is it? What's the problem? What are the opportunities? What needs to happen to bring about change? You know what? Out there's actually quite a lot of wisdom and quite a lot of knowledge, and not nearly enough, because there never is enough. But we kind of know how to go about worrying about that stuff and answering that stuff. So that's the potential knowns. The potential knowns is, forget resilience, let's just go back to what we know about, whether it's worrying about child poverty, whether it's worrying about debt, whether it's worrying about failures of the legal system, gender, and so on. So all of that is potential knowns. The problem is that too often in the aid world, it seems to me, when we worry about resilience, we try and worry about something else. We try and worry about resilience with a capital R. And that's what I would call the stuff that we shouldn't seek to know. And in what way do we need to change? I think we need to change a little bit the way we're thinking. We think about projects and we don't think about a plan. To put that in kind of the crudest possible terms, we think in terms of millions of euro instead of thinking in terms of billions of euro. Because we don't have the billions of euro, but we've got to bring about change on that level and leverage change and bring in more and so on. We think about assets, but we don't actually think about the economy. The only thing that gives assets life is an economy and the political and economic institutions that are around it. But we don't worry about that nearly as much as we worry about kind of how many goats have you got. My favourite of all, when I say favourite, this is one of the top of my list of phrases to be banned. Positive deviance. Have you come across that one? Do you use? Please don't tell me if you use it, because I'll get very upset. We have a model of resilience that says, let's look at who is different and try and make everyone like them. Which, I mean, when I was a child, I remember the joke about the village. People used to tell about the village in China. I don't know why China. It could be anywhere, where everybody makes a living by taking in their neighbour's laundry. You know, one person in the village can make a living by doing everybody else's laundry. But this idea that everybody should be like the people who are different, you know what? It doesn't work. And it's a wonderful way of transferring the blame. Instead of saying it's about the economy, it's about inequality, as our opener said. No, it's your fault because you ought to be like them over there. It's fantastic, isn't it? We've shifted the blame brilliantly. So that's. I also think, and I am coming to the end before I'm told to finish. I am. I wonder if we were looking in the wrong place. This is the thought. If we're going to think of a chain of levels, kind of going all the way from the individual through to the national economy. The NGOs tend to focus there, don't they? Households. We love households. And we love communities. I think we usually mean village or, whatever, or quartier, whatever it is. That's where, and if you go to the economists, they worry about the national economy, GDP per capita and stuff like that, yeah? And they don't really worry about everything else. But the more I have tried to listen to people's life stories and understand about how they cope, there are actually three areas, and I misformatted my slide. The three areas, it seems to me, that most matter to people are the individual, particularly gender, because that's the big issue, the extended family, which ought to be in red, and the local economy. And on that note, I will stop.